There is a moment that every military pilot trains for and hopes never comes. You are cruising at altitude, somewhere over open water, thousands of feet above the South China Sea. The mission is routine. At least it was. And then your radar warning receiver lights up. Then your wingman calls it out. Then you look left and see it. A fighter jet from another nation, close enough that you can see the pilot's helmet, close enough to read the markings on the fuselage, sitting off your wing like it belongs there. Your hands stay steady on the stick. Your voice stays flat on the radio. But inside that cockpit, inside your mind, 1,000 calculations are happening every second. Because this is not a training scenario. This is real. This is a live intercept over one of the most contested and dangerous stretches of ocean on the planet. And what happens in the next few minutes could determine whether this ends professionally or whether it escalates into something that changes history. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who wants to understand what actually happens inside the cockpits and command rooms of the most powerful military on Earth, subscribe right now. Most people who watch these videos never subscribe. That one click means you never miss a story like this one. Today, we are going deep inside one of the most tense and least understood scenarios in modern military aviation. We are going to walk through exactly what it looks and feels like when a United States military aircraft gets intercepted over the South China Sea. Not the diplomatic version, not the press release version, the cockpit version. What the pilots are thinking, what they are saying on the radio, what their hands are doing, what the rules say they can and cannot do, and why every single one of those intercepts carries with it the very real possibility of disaster. To understand the full weight of what we are talking about, you first need to understand the geography and why this particular body of water has become one of the most militarized and politically charged stretches of ocean on the entire planet. The South China Sea is roughly 1.4 million square miles of water, bordered by China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan. Through it flows an estimated $3 to $5 trillion worth of global trade every single year. Beneath it sit massive reserves of oil and natural gas, the full extent of which has never been precisely measured, but which multiple nations have spent decades fighting over in courtrooms, international tribunals, and increasingly, in the air and on the water. China claims the overwhelming majority of the South China Sea as its own sovereign territory. That claim is marked on Chinese maps by something called the 9-dash line, a boundary that stretches hundreds of miles from the Chinese mainland and encloses waters that international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, recognizes as belonging to other nations and in many cases as international waters open to all. The United States does not recognize the 9-dash line. It never has. The U.S. military routinely conducts what are called freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, flying aircraft and sailing warships through waters that China claims, but that international law says, belong to no one exclusively. These missions are deliberate, they are intentional, they are a legal and strategic signal that says the United States does not accept unilateral maritime claims that conflict with established international law, and China responds to those missions with intercepts. Let's set the scene the right way. Picture a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft. It is a large, multi-engine jet, a military version of the Boeing 737, and it is one of the workhorses of American intelligence gathering over the South China Sea. It carries a crew of typically 9 people. There are pilots up front, a flight engineer, and a team of naval flight officers and enlisted sensor operators in the back, all of them tracking submarines, surface ships, and other contacts across hundreds of miles of ocean. Or picture a U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress, the legendary long-range heavy bomber that has been flying since the 1950s and still operates today as one of the most recognizable symbols of American air power. It carries a crew of 5, and when it flies through the South China Sea, its presence is noticed immediately. Or picture a smaller, faster aircraft, a U.S. Navy F-18 Super Hornet, or a U.S. Air Force F-22 Raptor, flying an escort mission or a routine patrol. In each of these scenarios, the aircraft is operating in international airspace, following established flight plans, communicating on established frequencies, and following the rules of professional military aviation that have been developed and refined over decades of Cold War experience and post-Cold War engagement. And then something else shows up. The warning comes in multiple forms and it comes fast. The aircraft's radar warning receiver, which aircrews refer to simply as the RWR, detects that another aircraft's radar has locked onto them or is sweeping in their direction. At the same moment, The crew's own radar system may be picking up a fast-moving return closing from a specific bearing, and then the radio crackles. Air traffic control centers in the region, sometimes operated by Chinese military authorities, sometimes by civilian agencies, may issue a challenge. Other times, no challenge comes at all. Instead, the intercepting aircraft simply appears. In the case of intercepts by Chinese military jets, the intercepting aircraft is typically a People's Liberation Army Air Force or PLAF fighter. Over the years, the aircraft most commonly involved have included variants of the J-11, which is a Chinese derivative of the Russian Su-27 Sukhoi, the J-10, a domestically developed Chinese fighter, and more recently the J-16, a larger twin-engine multi-role fighter that has been at the center of some of the most alarming intercepts in recent memory. These are not outdated aircraft. They are modern, capable, armed fighters being flown by trained military pilots, and when one of them pulls up alongside, or in front of, or dangerously close to a U.S. aircraft over the South China Sea, the situation in that cockpit changes immediately. Here is what the pilot of the U.S. aircraft is thinking in those first seconds. The first thing is situational awareness. Every pilot in the military, from the most junior student aviator to the most experienced combat veteran, is trained from day one to know exactly where they are, what is around them, and what is happening. When an unknown or potentially hostile aircraft enters your proximity, the mind immediately begins running through a checklist that is not written down anywhere, but is deeply ingrained through years of training. Where is it? How fast is it moving? What angle is it approaching from? Is it maneuvering aggressively, or is it flying a standard intercept profile? Is it armed? Are its weapon systems active? Is my aircraft being painted by a fire control radar? The radar warning receiver tells you some of this, but not all. The pilot's eyes and judgment fill in the rest. The second thing happening simultaneously is communication. The pilot or co-pilot immediately gets on the radio and reports the contact. If there is a wingman, that call goes out immediately. If the aircraft is in communication with a U.S. Navy ship or a U.S. Air Force ground station, the contact is reported up the chain. In some cases, the crew of the intercepted aircraft is also in contact with an airborne early warning and control aircraft, something like a U.S. Navy E-2 Hawkeye or a U.S. Air Force E-3 Sentry AWACS, which has a broader picture of what is happening across a wide area and can provide immediate additional context. That communication loop is critical. It means that from the moment an intercept begins, multiple people in multiple locations are aware and engaged. The third thing happening is a very deliberate and conscious effort to remain calm and to follow established procedures. The United States military has developed detailed guidance for how its air crews are supposed to behave during intercepts. That guidance is rooted in decades of experience, including the Cold War era, when U.S. and Soviet aircraft regularly shadowed each other at close range. The basic principle is simple in concept and extremely difficult in execution. Do not do anything that can be misread as an offensive action. Do not escalate. Do not provoke. But also do not back down from your legal right to operate in international airspace. Hold your course. Follow the procedures. Stay professional. And document everything, because the documentation matters enormously. Video, radar data, radio recordings, crew statements, all of it becomes part of an official record that gets transmitted up the chain of command, and in some cases, eventually becomes part of diplomatic exchanges between governments. The U.S. pilot in that cockpit is not just a person flying an airplane. They are also a witness, a recorder, and a representative of their nation's position under international law. Now let's talk about the physical reality of what some of these intercepts have actually looked like, because the official statements from the Pentagon and the State Department often use careful diplomatic language that understates how genuinely dangerous some of these encounters have been. In August of 2023, a U.S. Air Force RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft was operating over the South China Sea in international airspace when a Chinese J-11 fighter flew directly in front of it at close range, forcing the American crew to take evasive action to avoid a collision. That is not a minor diplomatic incident. That is a near miss. The RC-135 is a large aircraft with a crew of more than 24 people. The J-11 passed close enough and with enough abruptness that the U.S. crew had to physically maneuver their aircraft to avoid being struck. The gap between a tense professional intercept and an international catastrophe in that moment was measured in feet and seconds. That same month, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon was intercepted by a Chinese J-11 that performed what the Pentagon described as an unnecessarily aggressive maneuver, flying extremely close to the P-8 and forcing that crew into a defensive situation as well. These are not anomalies. They are part of a documented pattern that has grown significantly more frequent and more aggressive over the past several years. The Pentagon's own tracking data shows that the number of intercepts in the Indo-Pacific region by Chinese military aircraft increased dramatically between 2021 and 2023, from what had been a relatively manageable pattern of professional if-tense encounters to what U.S. military officials described as increasingly unsafe and unprofessional behavior. Let those words sink in for a moment. Unsafe and unprofessional. In the language of military aviation, those words carry enormous weight. An unsafe intercept is one where the intercepting pilot's behavior creates a genuine risk of a mid-air collision. An unprofessional intercept is one where the intercepting pilot's behavior departs from the internationally recognized standards and procedures that exist specifically to prevent accidents during these encounters. So what does an unprofessional intercept actually look like from inside the cockpit of the U.S. aircraft that is being targeted? Let us walk through it in detail. The U.S. crew has been airborne for several hours. They are focused on their mission, whether that is tracking surface contacts, monitoring submarine activity, conducting signals intelligence collection, or simply demonstrating freedom of navigation by operating in international airspace. The flight has been routine, the radio chatter is professional and procedural, and then the radar returns appear. The contacts are fast, closing quickly from a bearing that puts them on an intercept course with the U.S. aircraft. The crew calls it out. The pilots begin monitoring the contacts carefully, and then the Chinese fighters appear visually, close enough to see, positioned in a way that makes their intent clear. They are here to intercept this aircraft. In a professional intercept, what happens next follows a set of internationally recognized procedures. The intercepting aircraft approaches from a specific angle, typically from behind and slightly to the side, levels out alongside the intercepted aircraft at a safe distance, and uses a combination of radio calls, standardized signals, and visual cues to communicate. The whole process is designed to be clear, safe, and unambiguous, because the history of international aviation includes too many accidents that resulted from ambiguous situations where one party misread another's intentions. Professional intercepts happen. They happen between militaries all over the world. They are not inherently dangerous. They can even be carried out with a degree of mutual respect between pilots who understand that both of them are doing their jobs. But what U.S. crews have increasingly documented over the South China Sea is not that. What they are documenting is something different. Approaches from angles that leave no safe escape. High rates of closure that do not decelerate until uncomfortably late. Maneuvers performed directly in front of or beneath the U.S. aircraft that put the intercepting jet in a position where any unexpected turbulence or navigation error by either pilot could result in a collision. In some of the most alarming cases, the use of weapons lock radar, meaning the intercepting pilot has activated a fire control system that is designed not for detection but for targeting. In a cockpit, when a fire control radar locks onto your aircraft, the warning system reacts differently and more urgently than when a search radar sweeps across you. That warning is unmistakable, and its message is visceral. Right now, in this moment, you are being aimed at. Think about what that feels like for a moment. You are a U.S. military pilot operating legally in international airspace, following every rule, conducting a legitimate mission, and an aircraft from another nation's military is flying close enough to touch and has activated a system designed specifically for shooting you down. What do? You follow your training. You hold your course. You get on the radio. You document. You stay professional. You do not flinch, and you do not give them a reason to escalate further. But every nerve in your body is telling you what is actually happening. You are in danger, and the only thing standing between this moment and a catastrophe is the discipline of your training, the professionalism of your crew, and the hope that the pilot in that other aircraft is not going to make an irreversible decision. The rules of engagement that U.S. military crews operate under in these situations are classified in their specifics, which means we cannot walk through the exact decision trees that pilots are authorized to follow. But the broad framework is known, and it is rooted in a fundamental principle that applies to all U.S. military operations. American forces always retain the right to self-defense. That right is real, it is legal, and it is backed by both military doctrine and international law. What it means in practical terms is that a U.S. military crew being aggressively intercepted over the South China Sea is not required to simply absorb whatever the intercepting aircraft does with no response available to them. They have options. The options are not unlimited. They do not begin with offensive weapons employment. But they are real, and every crew member on that aircraft knows what they are and when they can be used. The threshold for those options is extremely high, and it is set that high deliberately, because a shooting incident in the South China Sea, regardless of who fired first or why, would have consequences that extend far beyond any individual crew or mission. It would be an international crisis. It would potentially be the beginning of something that no one in any government actually wants to happen. So the rules are set conservatively. The crews are trained to be patient, and the intercepts continue. Let's go deeper inside the cockpit now and talk about what the individual crew members are doing on a more granular level, because it is easy to think of the intercepted aircraft as a single entity responding to a threat, but it is actually a team of human beings, each playing a specific role in managing the situation. In the front seats of an aircraft like the P-8, you have two pilots. One of them is flying the aircraft, the other is handling the radio, monitoring the instruments, and serving as the primary communicator both with the outside world and with the crew in the back. These two people are sharing an enormous amount of information with each other in real time, using a combination of intercom communication and physical gesture and years of crew coordination training to stay synchronized. The pilot flying has to keep the aircraft on its planned course, which sounds simple, but is not when another aircraft is maneuvering close by, because the natural instinct is to react to what you are seeing, and the training overrides that instinct and keeps you on course, and altitude and heading. The discipline required to hold course when something concerning is happening in your immediate visual field is not automatic. It is trained, practiced, and reinforced over hundreds of hours of simulation and real flight experience. In the back of the aircraft, the sensor operators and naval flight officers are doing several things simultaneously. They are continuing their mission to the extent possible. They are documenting the intercept with whatever recording systems are available and running on the aircraft. They are monitoring their own systems for any indications that the Chinese aircraft are doing something beyond a visual intercept. And they are in communication with their pilots and with any other assets in the area that can provide additional situational awareness. The crew coordination that happens during a live intercept is not chaotic. It is disciplined, structured, and deliberate. People are speaking in calm, professional voices, even when what they are seeing out the window is alarming. That calmness is not natural. It is the product of training that specifically simulates high-stress situations and teaches air crews to manage their physiological and emotional responses so that their voices and actions remain professional, regardless of what their nervous systems are doing. The voice discipline thing deserves its own moment of recognition because it is one of those details that separates military aviation from almost everything else in human experience. When you listen to the recorded radio communications from serious incidents, what you hear is often remarkable for what it is not. There is no panic, there is no elevated pitch, there is no trembling. There are clear, calm, professionally worded transmissions that convey exactly the information needed, no more and no less. That is not because the people speaking are not afraid, or stressed, or feeling the full biological weight of a dangerous situation. It is because they have been trained so thoroughly that the communication itself becomes a separate tracked skill that runs almost parallel to the emotional experience. They feel what they feel, and they say exactly what needs to be said. Those two things happen at the same time, in the same person, in the same moment. It is one of the most impressive human capabilities that military training develops, and it is on full display during every serious intercept over the South China Sea. Now let's talk about the aftermath, because what happens after an intercept is in many ways just as important as what happens during it. When the Chinese aircraft eventually break off and leave, when the proximity contact disappears from radar, and the crew of the U.S. aircraft is once again flying alone over the South China Sea, the mission is not over, and neither is the work. The crew immediately begins the process of formally documenting everything that just happened. Dates, times, positions, the sequence of events, the specific maneuvers they observed, the behavior of the intercepting aircraft, any radio communications that were exchanged or attempted, any weapon system activity that was detected. All of it goes into an official report that moves up the chain of command. That report is not a minor bureaucratic formality. It is a piece of evidence in a larger strategic and diplomatic picture that is being assembled by intelligence analysts, military planners, and policymakers at the highest levels of the U.S. government. When the Secretary of Defense references unsafe and unprofessional intercepts in a press conference, the specific data behind that characterization came from reports written by crews like the ones we have been talking about. When the State Department formally protests a specific incident to the Chinese government, the diplomatic note reflects details that were first captured in the cockpit. The crew member who was sitting in the back of a P-8 with shaking hands and a racing heart while a J-16 flew 3 feet off their wing and then carefully composed a formal report about it in professional aviation language is contributing to something that extends far beyond their individual mission. They are contributing to the historical record and to the policy decisions of a government and of an alliance. Let's talk about one of the most alarming specific categories of intercept behavior that has been documented in recent years, because it takes the scenario we have been discussing and adds a layer of danger that is difficult to fully convey without understanding how aircraft in flight actually interact with each other physically. It is called the weapons release maneuver, or in some documented Chinese intercepts, the use of what appears to be a deliberate and aggressive barrel roll over or around the targeted American aircraft. When a jet aircraft performs certain high-energy maneuvers at close range to another aircraft, it does not just create a visual threat. It creates a physical one. A fighter jet maneuvering aggressively produces vortices, which are rotating columns of turbulent air that extend behind and around the aircraft and can be extremely difficult for another aircraft to safely penetrate or avoid. The wake turbulence generated by a large aircraft is so powerful that airports maintain strict separation standards between landing aircraft, specifically to prevent smaller planes from being thrown out of control by the turbulent air left behind a large jet. Now imagine a military fighter performing high-energy maneuvers at close range to a large patrol aircraft. The turbulence created by those maneuvers is not a small thing. It is a physical force that can roll or pitch the targeted aircraft in ways that the crew did not initiate and cannot fully predict or control. When the U.S. military says that certain Chinese intercept maneuvers put U.S. crew members at genuine risk of losing their aircraft, this is part of what they are talking about. It is not just the visual proximity. It is the aerodynamic environment created by aggressive maneuvering at close range in a high-performance aircraft. The incident involving the RC-135 in August 2023 that we mentioned earlier is a direct example of this. The J-11 that crossed in front of the American aircraft did so at a speed and proximity that forced the American crew to take evasive action to avoid a collision. That evasive action was not a training maneuver performed in controlled airspace with a chase plane watching. It was a real emergency maneuver performed by a real crew in real airspace at the end of a long mission, responding to a real and immediate threat of collision. The fact that it worked, the fact that the RC-135 crew executed that maneuver successfully and brought their aircraft and their crew home safely, is a testament to the training and professionalism of those individuals. The fact that it was necessary at all, that a U.S. military aircraft operating in international airspace was put in a position where emergency evasive action was the only way to avoid being struck by another military aircraft, is the part that keeps senior military commanders awake at night, because the next time, it might not go that well. The margins in aviation are not flexible. They are fixed. And when the margins are violated, the consequences can be catastrophic, irreversible, and impossible to walk back diplomatically. Now here is something that does not get nearly enough attention in the public coverage of these incidents. The Chinese pilots conducting these intercepts are not rogue operators acting outside their chain of command. They are military aviators flying missions that were planned and authorized within the People's Liberation Army Air Force structure. When a Chinese pilot flies an unsafe intercept against a U.S. aircraft, that pilot is following orders, or at minimum flying within an established set of permissions and expectations that their command structure has put in place. That matters enormously for understanding what is actually happening strategically. This is not random. It is not one renegade pilot making bad decisions. It is a pattern of behavior that reflects a deliberate policy, implemented over years, escalating in frequency and intensity, designed to signal to the United States and to its regional partners and allies that China considers the South China Sea its domain, and that operating in that domain carries costs. The intercepts are the cost. They are designed to be uncomfortable. They are designed to be unpredictable. They are designed to raise the question in the minds of U.S. military planners and political leaders, is this mission worth the risk? And so far, the answer from the United States government and military has been consistent and clear. Yes, the answer is yes, because the moment the answer becomes no, the 9-dash line stops being a line on a Chinese map and starts being a de facto international reality. And that is a precedent that has consequences that extend far beyond the South China Sea. Let us spend some time on the diplomatic and military framework that is supposed to govern these kinds of encounters, because it exists and it matters, and the fact that it is being routinely violated is itself a significant part of the story. There is an agreement between the United States and China called the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, often abbreviated as CUES. It was agreed upon in 2014 at a meeting of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, and it establishes a set of procedures and communication protocols for naval and military aircraft encounters in international waters and airspace. The idea behind CUES is essentially to create a common operational language that both sides agree to follow, so that unplanned encounters do not escalate into accidents or conflicts due to miscommunication or ambiguity. It is a sensible framework. It reflects the kind of pragmatic military-to-military communication that helped the US and the Soviet Union manage their own tense close encounters during the Cold War, without those encounters leading to war. The problem is that in practice, the PLA has not consistently adhered to CUES during intercepts over the South China Sea. The maneuvers being documented by U.S. crews are not CUES-compliant professional intercepts. They are departures from that framework that appear to be intentional rather than the result of pilot error or misunderstanding. When the United States raises these incidents through diplomatic channels, Chinese government officials typically respond with a dismissal of the U.S. characterization, an assertion that Chinese military aircraft are operating legally in Chinese airspace or in defense of Chinese territorial claims, and a counter-allegation that U.S. military operations in the region are themselves provocative and destabilizing. The dialogue circles without resolution, and the intercepts continue. There have been some moments of military-to-military communication between the U.S. and China, aimed at reducing the risk of miscalculation. Senior Defense Department officials have met with their PLA counterparts. There have been discussions specifically focused on airspace safety and on the kinds of behaviors that risk escalation, but those conversations have been inconsistent, and their practical effect on the behavior of Chinese military pilots over the South China Sea has been, at best, limited. The U.S. military continues to operate in the region. The intercepts continue, and somewhere over that contested stretch of open water, right now, there are crews going to work knowing that this particular scenario is not hypothetical. Here is something worth understanding about the pilots themselves, both American and Chinese. Because in the coverage of these geopolitical encounters, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that these are individual human beings making individual decisions in extremely compressed time frames. The American pilots flying over the South China Sea are in many cases relatively young officers. Many of the P-8 mission commanders are lieutenant commanders or commanders, officers in their 30s, who have spent years building the skills required to lead these missions. The fighter pilots conducting the intercepts on the Chinese side are their approximate age equivalents within the PLA structure. These are not senior policymakers. They are not the people who decided that the 9-dash line is Chinese sovereign territory. They are professionals, doing a job that their chain of command has assigned them, operating within a set of rules and permissions that were established above their pay grade. And on any given day, the interaction between them, the American crew holding their course and the Chinese pilot closing at high speed, determines whether that day becomes a routine entry in a mission log or an international crisis that reshapes the relationship between two nuclear powers. The training that prepares American crews for this specific scenario is extensive and specialized. It includes classroom instruction on the rules of engagement, on the legal framework governing operations in international airspace, on the documented behaviors of specific PLA aircraft types, and on the history of previous intercepts, including the lessons learned from incidents that came uncomfortably close to going wrong. It includes simulation time specifically designed to replicate the experience of being intercepted at close range, including the sensory components of seeing another aircraft closing rapidly and the physiological response that creates. Military flight simulation has advanced to the point where the visual and vestibular experience of a close approach by another aircraft can be replicated with considerable fidelity, and those simulations are used deliberately to help pilots build the mental and emotional muscle memory to stay within procedures when their instincts are telling them to react. And it includes actual flight experience in progressively more complex and realistic training environments before crews are considered ready to fly the real mission in the real airspace. None of this training makes the experience of a real intercept routine or comfortable. What it does is give the crew the tools to manage the experience professionally, without making it worse. That is what training is for in these contexts. Not to eliminate the danger, not to eliminate the stress, but to ensure that the human response to danger and stress does not itself become a cause of catastrophe. Let us also acknowledge something that the official statements and press releases rarely say out loud. There are American military crews who have come home from missions over the South China Sea, shaken by what they experienced. Not broken, not defeated, shaken. Because some of these intercepts have been genuinely terrifying. The gap between what these crews present publicly, the professional, composed, by-the-book reporting of an unsafe and unprofessional intercept, and what some of them have experienced privately, the dry mouth and racing heart and the moment when you realize that the aircraft filling your windscreen was not going to move and you were going to have to, is real and significant. The military culture that produces that composure is an extraordinary thing. It is built over years. It is reinforced constantly. It is one of the genuine human achievements that military training produces. But it coexists with the full range of human emotional response to genuinely dangerous situations. And anyone who pretends otherwise does not understand what these crews are actually doing. Now let us pull back from the cockpit for a moment and look at the bigger strategic picture, because the individual intercepts we have been describing exist within a larger context that shapes their meaning and their consequences. The South China Sea has become the most contested body of water on Earth, not by accident, but by the deliberate strategic choices of multiple parties over multiple decades. China's construction of artificial islands in disputed waters, some of them built on submerged reefs and shoals that had no natural land features whatsoever, and the subsequent militarization of those islands with airstrips, radar systems, missile batteries, and permanent military garrisons, has fundamentally changed the physical environment in which U.S. and partner nation military aircraft operate in the region. Where once a patrol over the South China Sea was conducted over open water with no Chinese military presence for hundreds of miles, the same patrol route now passes within range of radar systems and surface-to-air missiles, based on artificial islands whose very existence is itself a violation of international law, as determined by an international tribunal in 2016. China rejected that ruling, and the islands and the military systems on them remain. This means that U.S. aircraft operating over the South China Sea are doing so in an environment that has become progressively more militarized, more surveilled, and more contested over the past decade. The airborne intercepts by Chinese fighters are one element of that environment. The ground-based radar and missile systems are another. The Chinese naval vessels that shadow U.S. ships and aircraft are another. The electronic warfare and signals intelligence systems that China has installed across the island chain are another. All of these elements work together to create an environment in which U.S. military operations in the South China Sea are contested in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and in which any individual crew or aircraft is embedded in a larger operational picture that extends far beyond what they can see from their cockpit. The U.S. military's response to this environment has been to continue operating, to increase the frequency and visibility of freedom of navigation operations, to deepen partnerships with regional allies including the Philippines, Australia, Japan, and others who share U.S. concerns about Chinese territorial claims, and to invest in the specific capabilities needed to operate effectively in contested airspace. That last point matters because the South China Sea environment is shaping how the U.S. military thinks about and invests in the next generation of aircraft, sensors, electronic warfare systems, and communication networks. The lessons learned from hundreds of intercepts over the South China Sea are feeding directly into acquisition programs and training curricula that will determine how American military aviation operates for the next several decades. The crews flying those missions today are not just doing their jobs in the present. They are generating the experience and data that will shape the future of how America projects air power in a contested environment. Here is a detail about these intercepts that very few people outside the military community fully appreciate. When a U.S. military aircraft is intercepted over the South China Sea, the rest of the operational picture does not stop. The mission continues to the extent possible. The reporting continues. The coordination with other assets in the area continues. The intercepted crew does not become so consumed with managing the intercept that everything else stops. That would be exactly the wrong outcome. One of the documented goals of aggressive intercept behavior is to disrupt the mission that the intercepted aircraft is conducting. If a P-8 is tracking a Chinese submarine and a Chinese fighter flies up alongside it and begins maneuvering aggressively, the desired effect from the Chinese perspective is to force the P-8 to break off, to stop tracking the submarine, to leave the area. A well-trained crew does not give them that. They manage the intercept with a portion of their attention and their trained procedures while continuing to conduct their mission with the rest. That is extraordinarily difficult. It requires the kind of compartmentalization and multi-track focus that professional military training is specifically designed to develop, and it is one of the most significant reasons why the investment in training for these crews pays dividends that go far beyond any individual sortie. The question of what happens when an intercept actually goes wrong deserves direct and honest engagement, because the history of U.S.-China military aviation is not without incidents where the situation did not resolve peacefully and professionally. The most significant of these is the EP-3 incident of April 2001, which remains the closest thing to a full crisis that U.S. and Chinese military aviation have produced in the post-Cold War era. A U.S. Navy EP-3E Ares II signals intelligence aircraft operating over the South China Sea on a routine collection mission was intercepted by two Chinese J-8 fighters. During the intercept, one of the Chinese fighters, piloted by a naval aviator named Wang Wei, came extraordinarily close to the American aircraft, closer than his first and second passes, and on that third approach there was a collision. The Chinese fighter struck the EP-3. The EP-3's propeller cut through the Chinese fighter, causing it to break apart. Wang Wei ejected but was never found. The EP-3, despite severe damage to its nose and one engine, was flown by its crew to an emergency landing on Hainan Island, a Chinese territory, where the 24 crew members were taken into custody by Chinese authorities. What happened in the cockpit of that EP-3 in the moments after the collision is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American military aviation. The aircraft was critically damaged. It was missing the nose cone. It was partially out of control. The crew was aware that they were in Chinese airspace and that landing on Hainan meant captivity, but the alternative, attempting to fly the damaged aircraft far enough over water to ditch safely, was evaluated against the condition of the aircraft and the survivability of that option. The aircraft commander, Lieutenant Shane Osborne, made the decision to land on Hainan. That decision itself represented a massive and immediate operational and diplomatic challenge, because the EP-3 was loaded with highly classified signals intelligence equipment, and the crew had only minutes to destroy as much of it as possible before landing. The crew members in the back of that aircraft worked frantically, physically destroying classified materials and equipment in ways and at a speed that had been drilled and prepared for precisely this kind of emergency, while Osborne and his co-pilot fought to keep the damaged aircraft in the air long enough to reach the runway. They made it. The crew survived. The diplomatic crisis that followed lasted 11 days and was resolved through a carefully worded U.S. statement that expressed regret without apologizing in the legal sense that China demanded. The 24 crew members came home. Wang Wei did not. And the incident shaped U.S.-China military relations and the rules governing operations over the South China Sea for years afterward. The 2001 EP-3 incident is the reference point that never leaves the mind of anyone planning or executing U.S. military aviation missions over the South China Sea. It is the proof of concept that these encounters can go catastrophically wrong in a matter of seconds through a combination of aggressive intercept behavior, miscalculation, proximity, and the fundamental physics of fast-moving aircraft in close airspace. It is also the proof of concept that a well-trained crew can survive and manage even the most extreme version of this scenario with professionalism and effectiveness. But survival is not the same as avoiding the incident in the first place. And the lesson that the U.S. military has taken from 2001, amplified by the incidents of 2023 and the pattern of increasingly aggressive intercepts in between, is that the risk is real and rising. Let us also talk about the allied dimension of this, because the United States is not alone in experiencing these intercepts. Australian military aircraft have been intercepted over the South China Sea. Canadian aircraft participating in multinational missions have encountered Chinese fighters. Japanese Self-Defense Force aircraft operating near the disputed airspace have had their own tense encounters. The pattern of aggressive intercept behavior is not reserved exclusively for American aircraft. It is applied across the range of nations whose militaries operate in airspace that China considers part of its territorial claim. That breadth matters, because it means the U.S. is not facing this challenge in isolation. It is facing it in the company of allies and partners who share the same fundamental interest in maintaining the principle of freedom of navigation in international airspace and waters. The coordination between the U.S. and its partners on how to collectively respond to these intercepts, how to document them, how to report them publicly, how to raise them in diplomatic channels, and how to conduct operations in ways that are mutually supportive, is a significant part of the strategic response. When the U.S. and Australia and Japan all operate in the South China Sea simultaneously, the intercept challenge for the PLA becomes more complex, and the intelligence picture for the U.S. and its allies becomes richer. Here is something that the numbers tell us. According to data that the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has made partially public, the number of what are characterized as unsafe or unprofessional intercepts by PLA aircraft against U.S. and allied military aircraft increased by more than 180% between 2021 and 2023. That number is not a projection or an estimate. It is based on documented incidents reported by actual crews who were actually intercepted. The acceleration of that trend is significant and concerning. It suggests not a policy of consistent aggressive harassment, but a policy of escalating aggressive harassment, one that has been ratcheting upward in both frequency and intensity over the period in question. What drives that escalation is a matter of significant debate among analysts and strategists. Some argue it reflects growing Chinese confidence in the capabilities of the PLA Air Force, and a deliberate decision to press harder on U.S. and allied operations in a region China considers vital to its interests. Others argue it reflects specific decisions by political or military leaders within China to raise the cost of U.S. operations in the region as part of a broader coercive strategy. Others point to the possibility that tactical-level commanders within the PLA have been given wider latitude to conduct aggressive intercepts than their predecessors enjoyed, and that the behavior of individual pilots reflects that expanded permission set more than it reflects a precisely calibrated political signal from Beijing. Regardless of the cause, the effect is measurable and documented. The airspace over the South China Sea has become more dangerous for U.S. and allied military crews than it was 2 years ago, and more dangerous than it was 5 years before that. The men and women who fly those missions know this. They read the reporting, they talk to colleagues who have come back from tense encounters. They sit through the classified briefings before their missions that include the latest intelligence on PLA intercept patterns and tactics. They know what they are flying into before they ever start the engines. And they go anyway. They go because their mission matters, because their government has determined that maintaining the principle of freedom of navigation in international airspace is worth the risk, and because their training has prepared them to manage that risk as professionally and safely as possible. That combination, understanding the risk fully and choosing to accept it because the mission matters, is the definition of what military service asks of the people who choose it. It is not abstract or rhetorical. It is a real choice made by real people who have real families waiting for them at home every single time a U.S. military aircraft takes off for a mission over the South China Sea. There is a human cost to operating in this kind of sustained, high-stress environment that does not always make the official reporting and that deserves acknowledgement. Crews who regularly operate in contested airspace, who know that every mission might include an intercept, who have experienced those intercepts firsthand and know what it feels like to have a foreign military aircraft maneuvering aggressively at close range, carry a cognitive and emotional load that is different from the load carried by crews operating in benign environments,